welcome back to the History of Christianity. Last time we looked at the Apostolic Church, which was a brief overview of what the church was like in the first century, and now we're going to transition or continue on in our timeline and move into the Patristic area, which takes place after the Apostolic Church. Today we are going to be looking at a couple of the Patristics, which patristic basically just means father, or it means the church fathers, and we're going to be looking at a couple of those today, and also how Rome started to begin to deal with the Christians, and at times persecution began to ramp up. Also, we're going to look at some of the rumors and accusations that the Romans brought against the Christians, which caused the need for a group of people to rise up, a group of Christian leaders to rise up called the apologists, to begin defending the faith and defending the practices of the Christians. So today we're going to be looking at the patristic era. Okay, class, we're now going to have the PowerPoint portion of this lecture on the early patristics and persecution. Okay, so what is the patristic era? It comes from the Latin word pater, which means father. So it would be the patristic era, or what we call the church fathers. This era is generally considered to be from the end of the apostolic age, around 100 AD, so after the Apostle John, to 451 AD, which is the date of the Council of Chalcedon. Now, there's a quote there. This kind of gives just a little idea of the attitude of the patristics when it came to persecution, because persecution did primarily happen during the patristic era, especially before Constantine became the Christian emperor in 313. But we see here Ignatius of Antioch says, "Now I begin to be a disciples, let fire and cross, flocks of beasts, broken bones, and dismemberment come upon me so long as I attain Jesus." So that's Ignatius of Antioch. And it was just this idea that they would give all for Christ. Everything that the Romans threw at them in regards to persecution, they would give it all. The Christians would give it all, even up to death. Now, that would only occur for some Christians, because some Christians did actually cave in and what we call lapse. They lapsed and gave into the persecution and did what the Romans wanted, which would cause further controversy a little bit later. Okay, so we have the second century persecution and martyrdom of the Christians. The interesting thing about this is that these accounts are recorded in a very detailed manner by the church fathers in some of their writings, and even in Roman writings, you can see quite detailed material of what took place when the Christians refused to cave to Rome. It showed the Christians' attitude towards martyrdom, and there were three categories regarding the martyrs. There were Christians that fled and escaped persecution. The heat was on, the Romans were after them, and they escaped. And the Christians looked at that it was not God's will for them to be martyred. They were to survive. They were to escape this. So that was the way they looked at it. There were also Christians that were martyred. And if the Christian was killed for their faith in God, it was looked at as that was God's will for them to be martyred for their faith. And then there were Christians that ran to become martyrs. So the Romans were killing Christians, and Christians would run to them and say, I'm going to die for Christ. Ironically, the Christians, they did not view that as true martyrdom. They viewed that as a false martyrdom, if you're going to be running to your death for Christ. And basically they thought that Christ would then desert them, and they would not be martyred for Christ, but Christ would desert them. So it reveals also the Romans' attitude toward Christians. So that was the attitude of the martyrs, and now we see the Romans' attitude towards the Christians, especially with these two men here, Pliny the Younger and Trajan, which is Emperor Trajan. And we see this in their correspondence back and forth because Pliny the Younger didn't really know what to do with all the Christians in his area that he ruled. He was a governor. Okay, so there on the left of the screen is Pliny the Younger. And then on the right is Emperor Trajan, a bust of him. Okay, so Pliny the Younger and Emperor Trajan. Pliny was governor of Bithynia, which is in today's northern Turkey, and he encountered many Christians. And in his area, the church had grown so much, and there were so many Christians that the pagan temples were empty. And that causes all kinds of issues, not just from a false religion standpoint, where their false gods are not being worshipped, but what they did was the pagans would bring offerings and money and give it in the temple of the false god, and of course the Romans would then use that as revenue, or the food or whatever was brought in they would bring into the Roman Empire for the Romans to use. Well, if the temples are empty, that stuff's not coming in. And so he was upset about this, that the Christians were no longer, the pagans were no longer coming into the temples, and there were just so many Christians. So he began to write letters to find out if this new religion was legal or not. He didn't really know what to do. And so while he wrote the letters and sent them off to the emperor, and in the meantime, he decided to kind of do his own thing. He brought the Christians before him, and if they recanted of not worshiping false gods, and then they went and worshipped the false gods, and they burned incense for the emperor, then they were set free. And he's like, okay, they're good. They might be calling themselves Christians, but they're good pagans. If they did not, and he gave them quite a bit of freedom or a number of times to do this, after 3 attempts of getting them to recant, then he would just kill the Christian, and they were executed or martyred. So that was what was going on while he was writing back and forth with Emperor Trajan. Now, many Christians refused, but Pliny, being a just man, again, not knowing what recourse to take, writing to the emperor, he wrote to the emperor, and Trajan responded. He responded that Pliny should, and here we go, not waste time and resources seeking out the Christians. And that was that's good for the Christian. So the Romans aren't hunting down the Christians. But, so he says there, however, if the Christian was found out or was in custody for another crime, and it was found out that they were Christians, then they would be try to get them to recant and again worship the false god, burn the incense. Then they would be okay. But if they refused to recant, then they would be killed. That's what Trajan said to do. Don't hunt them out. Don't waste the resources. But if you have one in custody, or you find out that they're a Christian or something, have them recant. If they don't recant, then they should be killed. And this became the Roman policy for the 2nd and into the 3rd century. This was kind of like how the Romans dealt with the Christians. So the Christians had some peace during this time. But in parentheses there, I have to say that, not to say that persecution stopped, because again, depending on the emperor, depending on what was going on, there were times that persecution did flare up, and it was extreme persecution. It flared up, and many Christians were killed. But for quite a length of time, into the 2nd century into the 3rd century, the Christians could basically be at peace in the empire. Okay, so we're going to look here now at one of the early church fathers. His name is Ignatius of Antioch. He's the one that I read that quote from before. And there's just a picture of him. A lot of these, I'll have some of these pictures of these guys and some of these people up there, and they kind of look the same, but that was Ignatius of Antioch. Okay, 30 A.D., so he was born right around the time of Christ's death, or ministry and then death, 30 A.D. To 108 A.D., so he lived about 78 years, and it's questioned about his actual date of death. Born around 30 A.D., unclear of the time of death, in custody and on his way to Rome for martyrdom at the amusement of the people. So Ignatius, there's not a lot of information about Ignatius' early life. And it's kind of like he gets picked up in his story of his life, and he's in custody on his way to Rome. He was a church leader. We know that he was a church leader, and he was on his way to Rome for martyrdom at the amusement of the people. And it's not known again why he was arrested, but in his letters that he wrote, it is revealed that he was preaching against heresy in Antioch. He was held with great prestige in the Roman Christian community, and on his way to Rome, he was actually allowed visitors. And this is kind of an interesting note about Ignatius of Antioch. Bishop Onesimus of Ephesus visited him. And many scholars believe this may have been the same Onesimus as in the book of Philemon. So if you grab your Bible, go to Philemon, read that. It's a very short book. Read that. Many Christian scholars believe that this is the same Onesimus. He wrote 7 letters. One of them was to Polycarp. And Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John. And so now we start getting this lineage of teachers to students and teachers to students, and it'll continue on. But Polycarp was a disciple of John. He sat at the feet of the Apostle John who taught him. Most important letter written to the Church of Rome was that he had heard the Christians in Rome were going to try to break him free as he was going to be martyred. And in his letter, he urged them not to free him, but to pray for him, as he was, and this is a quote in the letter, God's wheat to be ground by the teeth of beasts, so that I may be offered as pure bread of Christ. Okay, so he was going to his martyrdom, and he said, don't stop what's going to happen. Don't try to break me free. I'm going to be a witness for Christ. And he was executed by lions, and that account is actually stated by Jerome, who we'll get to later, but executed by lions as stated by Jerome soon after his arrival to Rome. So that's an early church father, Ignatius of Antioch. And here's a painting of him being killed by the lions. Definitely has an early medieval kind of style to it, just with the way the perspective is, and you can see this guy here. I mean, how's he even fitting in that castle? You know, the lions are just kind of floating in air. So that was definitely probably an early medieval painting of Ignatius of Antioch's martyrdom. Okay, next is Polycarp, who I just said, and there's a picture of him. Again, they look kind of the same, but these are images that artists have done of these guys. Polycarp, 69 A.D. to 155 A.D. So he was an infant when Jerusalem was destroyed. To 155 A.D. He was a disciple of the Apostle John, as I just said. A group of Christians in Smyrna were brought to trial and urged to recant. They refused and were threatened with torture and death. There was a man named Germanicus, who was an old Christian. He said he would rather die than live in a world of the unjust. When he said this enraged the court, and a mob gathered to go find their bishop. This group of Christians that were arrested, well, they had a bishop, they had a pastor. And when Germanicus said that he would rather die, then off they go to find their bishop. And their bishop was Polycarp. At first, Polycarp fled and hid. He heard they were coming to get him, and he fled and hid. But then he heard that the mob knew where he was. And so when he found out that they were still coming to get him, he deemed it that it was the will of God that he should be martyred. So based on his advanced age, he was 86 years old, the judge urged him to worship the emperor and burn incense. And Polycarp, it's kind of a famous response, but Polycarp's response is, for 86 years I have served him, meaning Christ. I have served him, and he has done me no evil. How could I curse my king who saved me? So Polycarp was then taken and burned at the stake, and while he was burning, a spear was thrust through his body because he would not burn the incense to the emperor. And here's just an artistic picture here of of what's going on. So he's being burned there at the stake, and in comes the soldier with a spear or the sword to stab him. And we'll definitely talk about more church fathers. Those weren't the only two church fathers. There's many church fathers, and you can just see that on your syllabus, that we're going to be going through some of these guys. But we come now to the apologists. So again, the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it was illegal to be a Christian, but they were not sought out. Again, that was the policy. Don't seek them out. Just, if you capture them, or you have them in custody and you find out they're Christians, then you could persecute them. But on the local level, there were accusations and there were persecutions and there were martyrdoms that did occur. And what happened was there were many false accusations and rumors that began circulating about these quote-unquote atheist Christians. Again, they worshipped an invisible God, so the Romans looked at the Christians as atheists, that they worshiped no God at all. But in reality, they were worshiping the true God. So there was these accusations and rumors. And the Christians, they felt that they needed to clarify their beliefs and clarify their practices to refute these false rumors. And this gives rise to the apologist. And the apologist, it basically means to give a defense. It doesn't mean you're sorry for anything. Don't think apologist as an apology, like I'm sorry for being a Christian. No, that's not what that means. Apologist means to give a defense. That's why we have courses on apologetics, how to give a defense of the Bible or of your faith. So apologist means to give a defense. Now here's the false beliefs and rumors. I have 5 of them here. Make sure you know these. Okay, write these in your notes, study them. Okay. Number 1, they were accused of incestuous relationships and debauched living. Okay. And then I have just the explanations underneath of it. Be familiar with that. What happened was the Christians would get together and fellowship. The churches would meet in homes, and they would have what they would call a love feast, because Christians are to love God and love each other and love your neighbor and all of that. Well, they had these love feasts, and it was the church meeting in the home, and they would eat a meal, usually with the Lord's Supper. Okay, so this is setting the stage for the Romans to accuse these Christians of incestuous relationships and debauched living. In regards to the relationships, the Romans had a big issue with the Christians calling each other brother and sister, to include spouses. And so when you call your wife sister, or the wife calls the husband brother, the Romans are like, well, they were probably really brother and sister, so there's an incestuous relationship. And then they were accused of drunken orgies in this relationship. So that's number 1, incestuous relationship and debauched living. Number 2, communion was a cannibalistic feast. Okay, so communion, meaning the bread would represent the body of Christ, the wine, the blood of Christ, and when they would partake of this, they were accused of actually eating flesh and drinking blood. And because the worship of Jesus also included the story of his birth, born of the Virgin Mary and all of that, like we celebrate at Christmas time, the worship of Jesus and the story of his birth, the Romans accused the Christians of taking an infant and baking the infant into a loaf of bread and then eating the loaf of bread, so they were cannibals eating this infant. Okay, so that was the second accusation or rumor. Number 3, the Christians were an ignorant, subversive group led astray by self-contradicting messages. Okay, so rich Romans believed this about the Christians because many Christians were poor. And so based on class prejudice, and they were viewed kind of as a rabble who derived their beliefs, again, not from the Greeks or from the Romans, but from the Jews, they were accused of being a group that would tear apart the fabric of Roman society. So they were accused of being a subversive group. Number 4, the Christian God was a ridiculous concept. Okay, so they were accused, or the false belief that was attributed to them was that You have this almighty God who's omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent God that would be bothered with the daily affairs of Christians, meaning that God would be bothered with what someone would say or what they ate or what they did. Basically, the Romans accused the Christians of worshiping a God that was a busybody. Now, they also accused them of being atheists because God is invisible, so they were accused of being atheists. I've already mentioned that. But now they're saying, basically, why would your omnipotent, all-powerful God, why would he even bother with these daily affairs of Christians? And then number 5, the last one here, is resurrection based on Jesus. The Roman pagans had numerous versions of who Jesus was, and that any true quote-unquote Son of God would never allow himself to be crucified. So they rejected, the pagans rejected this because they were saying if Jesus is God and all of that, he would never he would not allow himself to be killed. There is a belief that the dead Christian being raised to life is ludicrous. So the belief that Christians are resurrected at their death to be with Christ, they said that's just ridiculous. And especially those that were burned at the stake, eaten by animals, dismembered, bodies destroyed, whatever. The Romans said, how could God gather up all of those pieces to have this resurrection? So these are the 5 false beliefs and rumors that the Christians were accused of. So incestuous relationship, communion was cannibalistic, Christians were ignorant, subversive group, the Christian God was a ridiculous concept, and resurrection based on Jesus, again to the Romans, to the pagans, was ridiculous. So the Christians, they're being accused of all of these things. They believe they needed to give a defense of what these accusations are against them. And so we have the rise of the apologists. And we're not going to go through these all or anything like that, but here's just a list of the apologists there on the screen. Aristides, Justin Martyr, Tatian, Theophilus, Bishop of Antioch, Origen, Felix, and Tertullian. Okay, so here's the apologist defense. Okay, so the first thing is they would defend with philosophy. Okay, so especially Justin. Use of philosophers' belief of a supreme being and life beyond death and logos. So if you think about Greek philosophy and going back there, that's several centuries before Christ, the apologists believe, or excuse me, the philosophers believed in a supreme being. They believed in life after death, so there would be some kind of resurrection, and also this idea of logos. Secondly, we have this defense against this incestuous and cannibalistic activity. They give a defense of that. They said that they would teach that even evil thoughts must be cast aside. Just evil thoughts, not actually even doing them. Christianity taught evil thoughts are to be cast aside, while Roman culture was the one that was morally corrupt. And here that's supposed to be eating children, like eat children. That's a misspelling. Apologize for that. But eat children when all violence and bloodshed is repugnant to Christians. Okay, so there was kind of this idea that they're separating from the Roman government and all of that, and some the Christians for the most part did not serve in the Roman army. Of course, there were Christians in the Roman army, but just this idea of violence and bloodshed was repugnant to the Christians. So how could they even be accused of eating children? So that's the defense given there. Then we have defending about being atheist. Again, they went back to the philosophers. They actually said that some respected ancient philosophers were true atheists, and they're respected. So they're accusing the Christians of being atheists, but they're being persecuted for it. Why does a visible god or idol made of gold need protection from thieves? That was another argument the apologists said. The Romans had all kinds of gods and all kinds of idols and gold and all of that, but they had to be protected in temples. They had to be protected by temple servants so that thieves wouldn't come and steal them. Well, why would a god need to be protected? How can a god be made of human hands be above humans? There's another defense. These are just kind of almost like obvious defenses given. Defending regarding the resurrection. Just by definition, an omnipotent God means that God has the power to do anything with his creations, so why couldn't he raise them to spiritual life? If he's an omnipotent God, he can raise them to spiritual life. And then defend against being called subversive. Now, the Christians did admit that they're not going to worship the emperor, and so they may be looked at as subversive that way. However, they came to their defense by saying that really Christians are loyal subjects of the emperor. And their main argument was that the emperor does not need to be worshipped, but the emperor needs to be served by the loyal subjects in the empire. So this list, this is a defense that the apologist gave against those accusations. And that's going to be it for this PowerPoint. I'll see you in a second. Okay, class, that's it for the early patristics. Next time, we're going to continue on with the patristics, and we're going to begin to look at the schools and the teachers of the patristic period. We'll be getting into some more detail of individual leaders in the church and the schools in the church. We'll be looking also at a couple of the different false beliefs that were rising up that caused the patristics to have to defend against those and begin to develop what we would call orthodox doctrine. So we'll be looking at that next time. Other than that, I don't have anything else. Make sure you keep up on that reading. Take care.